For more than 20 years, I worked cases that most people could never stomach. Missing persons, cold trails, crimes that left families broken and communities shaken. I've seen my share of twisted minds, but nothing prepared me for the case of Haddon Clark. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still feel the weight of it. The night Laura Hoteling vanished, the world outside seemed ordinary. Suburban streets, the faint hum of cars in the distance, porch lights flickering across lawns. But behind that normalcy, something was waiting. Something that would take a vibrant young woman's life and reveal a darkness far stranger than anyone could imagine. It was late afternoon when the first call came in. Laura hadn't shown up to meet friends. At first, it sounded routine. Young people sometimes stray, distracted by work or relationships. But this felt different. Her family's voices carried a tremor. They knew Laura's habits. They knew she wouldn't simply vanish. By evening, the air had thickened with unease. It was autumn, and the fading light cast long shadows across the pavement. I remember stepping onto Laura's street, the crisp wind carrying leaves across the road. Every detail felt magnified. The silence of the houses, the echo of each footstep. Something in my gut whispered, this wasn't just a missing person case. Neighbors described a man they'd seen lurking nearby. Awkward, quiet, someone who seemed to blend in yet always left a lingering discomfort. His name? Haddon Clark. A man who lived in the area, often doing odd jobs, keeping mostly to himself. Some recalled seeing him walking in women's clothing, wigs, dresses, makeup. They laughed it off as eccentric. But to me, that strangeness was a red flag waving in the wind. The search for Laura turned frantic within days. Flyers covered telephone poles. Volunteers combed through parks and woods. Still, no trace. But suspicion turned quickly toward Clark. He had been near the house. He had a history of odd, troubling behavior. And when police brought him in, his responses sent chills through the room. He didn't deny knowing Laura. In fact, he admitted he'd been around. But the way he spoke, fragmented, detached, almost rehearsed, suggested a mind fractured by something deeper. One moment calm, the next rambling about disguises, about hiding who he truly was. It was as though he lived half in reality, half in some world he had created for himself. Then came the discovery that changed everything. In Clark's possession were items that could only have belonged to Laura. Small things, personal things, the kind of objects killers keep as trophies. Suddenly, this wasn't a case of a missing woman. It was murder. When investigators pressed Clark, the truth spilled out in jagged pieces. He confessed not with remorse, but with a strange sense of distance, as though he were talking about someone else's crime. He admitted to luring Laura, killing her, and burying her body in a shallow grave. And then, as though that wasn't enough, he described how he had disguised himself afterward, dressing in Laura's clothing, walking the streets as though wearing her skin. That detail, that grotesque misdirection, is what still haunts me. It wasn't just murder. It was theater. A performance designed to confuse, to disturb, to let him slip unseen through the cracks of society. Clark was arrested and later convicted for Laura's murder. For many, that should have been the end of it. Justice served, the nightmare over. But with Clark, nothing was ever that simple. Behind bars, he began talking about other crimes. Stories that reached back decades. Stories of women whose names had been lost to time, whose bodies had never been found. And then he mentioned something that made every investigator in the room freeze. He spoke about a woman he claimed to have killed in Massachusetts. Years before Laura, a woman whose description, whose death, matched almost perfectly with one of the coldest, most haunting mysteries of the Northeast, the case of the Lady of the Dunes. The Lady of the Dunes was discovered in 1974, buried in the sands of Cape Cod, her hands severed, her face unrecognizable, her identity unknown. For decades, detectives hunted for answers. They pursued theories linking her to mobsters, to notorious killers like Whitey Bulger. Yet every lead collapsed into dust. The Lady of the Dunes became more than a victim. She became a ghost-haunting American true crime. So when Haddon Clark began describing a murder that echoed her case, investigators leaned in. Could this disturbed man, already convicted of one brutal killing, be tied to one of the most enduring mysteries in criminal history? Clark's words were scattered, as though each confession was a fragment torn from his mind. But the details he gave about the woman in Massachusetts, her clothing, her jewelry, the way he had hidden her, carried an uncanny resemblance to the Lady of the Dunes. He even hinted that he had kept trophies, souvenirs from victims, tucked away like relics of a life only he could understand. To investigators, this was both a revelation and a torment. On one hand, they may have found the missing link in a case that had haunted Cape Cod for decades. On the other hand, Clark's instability made it hard to separate truth from delusion. Was he confessing to draw attention? Or was this the unfiltered honesty of a man who no longer cared about the weight of his secrets? Forensic teams pored over Clark's claims. They retraced old evidence, re-examined photographs, and compared the timeline of his life. What they found was unsettling. Clark had indeed been in the Northeast during the period the Lady of the Dunes was killed. His movements were erratic, his history scattered across states, filled with gaps no one had fully tracked. Suddenly the possibility became real. Maybe Laura hadn't been his only victim. Maybe she was just the one that brought him into the light. But here's the thing about Clark. He thrived in that gray space between reality and illusion. His disguises weren't just wigs and dresses. They were layers of identity, masks he wore to confuse both the world and himself. Psychologists later argued that Clark's compulsion to dress in women's clothing was about more than disguise. It was about inhabiting another life, becoming someone else so he didn't have to face the monster in the mirror. Even behind bars, Clark's behavior was erratic. He spoke to fellow inmates about killings, sometimes boasting, sometimes whispering as if sharing secrets with ghosts. Some of those stories lined up with real unsolved cases. Others sounded like fantasies. Yet with Clark, the line between the two was razor thin. He was a man both broken and dangerous, a storm that never stopped swirling inside. Laura's family, meanwhile, carried the scars of what he had done. Losing her was tragedy enough. Learning the grotesque details of how Clark had mocked her memory, how he had worn her belongings in twisted imitation, was a wound that never fully healed. For them, justice felt partial. 30 years in prison could never equal the life taken. And yet perhaps the most haunting aspect of Haddon Clark's story isn't what we know. It's what we don't. How many victims were there really? Did he kill the Lady of the Dunes, leaving her faceless in the sands of Cape Cod? Or was it another one of his illusions, another cruel trick designed to keep his name alive in the shadows of crime history? The evidence points in both directions. Some investigators believe Clark's confession holds weight. Others dismiss it as the ramblings of a disturbed man desperate for notoriety. Even today the debate continues, and the Lady of the Dunes remains a ghost story etched into the coastline of Massachusetts. What makes Clark's case so disturbing isn't just the violence, it's the psychology. He was not the charismatic predator we often imagine when we think of serial killers. He was awkward, often ignored, a man who seemed forgettable until he wasn't. And maybe that's what makes him so terrifying. Because if someone like Clark could carry such darkness unnoticed, how many others are out there, blending into the background of ordinary life, hiding their shadows behind polite smiles and everyday routines? When I think back on this case, I don't just remember the evidence bags or the courtroom scenes. I remember the feeling of stepping into his world, a place where reality bent, where disguises masked horrors, and where truth itself felt like smoke in the air. Haddon Clark is serving his sentence now, but the echoes of his crimes remain. The shallow grave of Laura, the whispered confessions of other victims, the unanswered question of the Lady of the Dunes. Together they form a story that feels less like history and more like a nightmare that refuses to fade. To this day, I can't explain everything we uncovered. Was Clark a serial killer hiding beneath layers of disguise? Was he truly responsible for one of America's most enduring mysteries? Or was he simply a broken man who blurred the line between truth and fantasy until even he no longer knew the difference? All I know is this: the case of Haddon Clark is not just about murder. It's about masks. The ones we wear to hide who we are, the ones that protect us, and the ones that reveal the monsters we hope never exist. So I'll leave the final question with you. What do you think? Was Haddon Clark the killer behind the Lady of the Dunes, or just another ghost story whispered in the dark? Merci.